I'm Lindsay Grossman.
Mick Grossman.
And our kids are Benji and Leo Grossman.
Wonderful. So tell us a little bit about what you discovered about your family.
Jewish tradition teaches us a special concept, the door vador, from generation to generation. Stories are told to keep the past alive, to connect our ancestors with our descendants, and because they ask something of us. When I started researching our family tree, I was hoping to learn more about where we came from and to share the story with my kids. But what I discovered became something so much more. The story I am telling today is that of my great-great-uncle Joe, Dr. Joseph J. Schwartz, a man who spent his life facing incredible problems you may have faced on a smaller scale yourself. When you witness suffering and injustice, how do you respond? When you have the opportunity to build something better, do you take it? Joseph Schwartz answered those questions in extraordinary ways. But if he were here today, I think he would argue his accomplishments are the least important part of the story. He would say his legacy belongs to the people he helped, the lives that continued because he refused to stop, the families rebuilt, and the children who grew up. This story is a gift passed down to us. But in the Jewish tradition, a story is also a demand. As you listen, I want to ask you the same question I've been asking myself. Now that you know Uncle Joe's story, what will you do? To understand Joe Schwartz, we have to understand the world that he lived in. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you're part of a Jewish family in Europe during the 1930s. You own a modest grocery store. Your parents, brothers, and sisters live upstairs. Friday nights are warm, loud, and filled with tradition. You have every expectation that tomorrow will look just like today. But then, piece by piece, normal life vanishes. New laws target you. Your home and business is seized by the government, and soon you are forced into crowded, walled-off sections of the city called ghettos. The neighbors and friends you trusted ignore the suffering of your people. Now your daily life is full of impossible choices. If you only have enough food for one person, which child eats? If sending your daughter or son away with strangers increases their chance of survival, do you say goodbye? These heartbreaking dilemmas defined Uncle Joe's life. As a European director of the American Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, he became the anchor for massive covert rescue networks. Dangerous clandestine work that relied on rogue diplomats forging visas, couriers smuggling cash across borders, and ordinary people risking execution to hide a Jewish family in a cellar or an attic. Joe expertly raised the funds, cut the red tape, and built ghost systems that kept running even when European society collapsed. He was relentless, traveling through active war zones disguised as a high-ranking American military officer, just to slip through checkpoints, reach cut-off Jewish communities, and coordinate aid, something no one else could or would do. He operated in a blurred area between humanitarian rescue and illegal activity. Joe chose to act rather than wait for permission, solving problems like how to move millions of dollars into occupied territory, or smuggling thousands of people who legally no longer exist across borders. But the crisis he was so desperately trying to solve was on the verge of becoming much, much worse.
By the early 1940s, a horrific reality emerged. Whispers from exhausted refugees and underground couriers turned into concrete reports. They spoke of trains packed to the ceiling with men, women, and children. Trains that left town and never returned. Vibrant Jewish neighborhoods that suddenly fell silent. When the fragmented truth finally took shape, Joe held the awful knowledge that these communities were being systematically exterminated one by one. His mission shifted instantly. He was no longer trying to alleviate poverty or ease oppression. He was racing to save people from slaughter. Colleagues noted that Joe threw his entire body and soul into his mission. People who saw him during the war described him as looking like someone straight off the battlefield, emaciated, sleepy, and fatigued, working straight through the night until dawn. For him, there were no reserves who could step up and take his place in the war, nowhere he could retreat to. Joe was fighting the evil of Hitler and the Nazis day after day for years. But no matter how hard he worked, Joe knew that he couldn't stop every train, that he couldn't reach every isolated village. Which is where I find myself asking, how did he keep going? How did he keep fighting? What I've come to understand, and what Joe must have known deep in his soul, is that every child hidden, every refugee smuggled over a border, every person kept alive, was an act of rebellion against the Nazi regime. He kept fighting because he believed that if you cannot save everyone, you better keep going to save everyone you can. When Allied soldiers broke open the gates of the concentration camps in 1945, millions of people poured into the streets around the world to celebrate victory in Europe. But for the survivors, the nightmare didn't end with a ceasefire. For them, the path to freedom barely even existed. Hundreds of thousands of people were moved into temporary displaced persons camps, places where they were supposed to start rebuilding their lives. Yet, they were still living behind barbed wire, under the watch of armed guards, and wearing the striped uniforms of the concentration camps, or perhaps more cruelly, the uniforms of former Nazi military officials. Most had no parents, no partners, no children, or no homes to return to. Unsurprisingly, they still felt like prisoners. Joe knew that if survivors were ever going to reclaim their dignity, the world first had to understand their suffering. To expose the reality facing Holocaust survivors, Joe spent the next 3 weeks escorting President Truman's special envoy, Earl Harrison, through more than 30 displaced persons camps across Germany and Austria. He forced Harrison to look directly at the horror. The resulting Harrison Report shocked President Truman and Americans as a nation. Harrison famously wrote, "We appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them." That report broke down many of the remaining barriers. It forced the military to improve camp conditions and recognize Jewish survivors as a group with specific, desperate needs.
The most striking change, though, wasn't from government policy. It was from the survivors themselves. With Joe and the JDC devoting immense time and resources, survivors began reclaiming a future that had nearly been stolen from them. Against all odds, young people found comfort in one another. They got married and had children. Their revenge against the Nazis was to rebuild. Sadly, every marriage ceremony was marked by the painful absence of murdered parents and siblings. Women openly wept, wondering if their starved bodies could ever bear children or if their broken hearts could ever love again. One woman later recalled her terror at finding out she was pregnant in a DP camp. "I jumped off the table like a mad woman. I don't want a baby. I heard babies screaming in Auschwitz. I don't want it." But months later, when they placed her live, breathing son into her arms, she wept and prayed for God to let her keep him. Each birth wasn't just a miracle. It was a new generation of hope, a generation that was looking towards the future. Joe's effort in running the JDC in Europe after World War II was staggering, not just for the hours he poured into his work, but because the social work he did was revolutionary. He developed and implemented several different methods for gaining support, both financially and socially, that are still used in humanitarian work today. Methods that saved millions of people before, during, and after the war. And just like Uncle Joe, the Jewish generation that Nazis tried to exterminate would never give up and never stop fighting.
Over time, it became obvious that the Jewish future could not remain in the ashes of Europe. What survivors wanted was simple: safety, a steady job, and a place to raise children without scanning the horizon for danger. When asked where they wanted to go, the answer was near unanimous: Palestine. But the path there was blocked. Palestine was under strict British control, and immigration was heavily restricted. Once again, Joe found himself operating in the shadows. He threw his support behind several Jewish underground movements, smuggling refugees across Europe past the British naval blockades and into Palestine. By the end of the 1940s, Joe was overseeing aid for more than 1 million people across 30 countries. Under his watch, over 500,000 survivors were successfully moved to the newly born state of Israel, the United States, and Latin America, helping them to achieve a future of their own. But Joe's work did not end with the founding of Israel. In the years that followed, he continued helping Jewish communities across the globe. He played a key role in supporting the migration of Jews from North Africa and the Middle East, including rescue efforts that brought tens of thousands of Iraqi and Yemenite Jews to Israel. Later, as Executive Vice President of Israel Bonds, he helped secure the financial resources needed to build and strengthen the young state he had worked so hard to support.
After countless hours, digging through archives, records, and statistics, I find myself lying awake at night, wondering who the man was behind it all. What was he like in his quiet moments? What did he have that kept him going, and do I have it in me too? After talking to several relatives who knew Uncle Joe, I found he was a remarkably humble and kind person. He didn't brag, even when talking about outsmarting Nazis. He didn't take himself too seriously, and never wanted to be idolized. The spirit of Uncle Joe is found in the small stories I have learned about him. Like the story when a young family desperately found him in the streets of Paris. While he was officially directing the rescue of 50,000 refugees in France, there were rules he had to follow, like he could only take their address instead of providing immediate aid. But late that night, long after working hours were over, there was a knock on that family's door. It was Joe, standing in the dark, his arms piled high with blankets, clothes, food, and cash from his own pocket. For him, rules would never override humanity. Years later, from 1955 to 1970, he settled in Israel and served as the executive vice president of the Israel Bonds organization. Cousins from across the world would come visit him, many he had never met, and he always made them feel welcomed and valued. Even though he was running global networks, they never got the sense he was rushing their time together. Joe was a person who brought friends and family together. He held many Shabbat dinners at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. One night, in a rush to get to one of these dinners, cousins of ours found out just how much Uncle Joe was intertwined with the lives of complete strangers. Trying to get to dinner on time, the group unknowingly parked in an illegal spot. So, of course, a police officer walked up, ready to write a ticket. As the driver started explaining they were rushing inside to see Uncle Joe, the officer froze. He told our cousin how his start in Israel wouldn't have been possible without the support of Joe Schwartz. See, when the officer was first immigrating to Israel, like so many others, he had nothing to his name. one day, perhaps in an official capacity, or maybe by a chance encounter, he met Uncle Joe. When Joe learned of this young man's story, he reached into his pockets and gave him everything he had. This was the money he needed to marry his wife, to start their future together. Needless to say, the officer didn't write them a ticket that night. I discovered Uncle Joe was undeniably shaped by his profound Jewish values. Learning about his life has allowed me to reflect more deeply on values of my own, something I think the rabbi in him would be very proud of. Years after his life, I keep coming back to the famous teaching of Rabbi Hillel that I learned through Uncle Joe, and I want to leave you with it now. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? And if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? We would like to give credit and thanks to the Jewish Museum of Maryland Archives, JDC Archives, Professor Tuvia Frilling, Jewish Telegraphic Agency, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and Yad Vashem Archives. We also would like to dedicate this podcast to my Poppy Dave.
Thank you for listening.